Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our podcast dedicated to sight reading through the lens of historically informed performance practice. My name is Darina Blogina.
And I'm Sebastien Mitra.
And today we have a guest again.
Another guest. Who is our guest? What's your name?
My name is Peter Croton.
And what do you do?
Croton.
What do I do? I do various things, but I spend a certain amount of my time playing lute and teaching lute, and other things like chamber music and basso continuo and improvisation, sometimes playing a bit of jazz guitar, sometimes writing music, writing songs, and that's sort of covers my professional life.
Mm-hmm. And what are you doing here in Basel?
I came here in 1979 to study lute at the Schola, and I stayed and got some work, and then in 1989 I began teaching lute at the Schola. Previously, actually in 1984, I started teaching lute at the Conservatory of Music in Biel, which then turned into Bern. So I've been teaching in Bern and Basel since 1984, actually.
So what are we doing today?
So today it's one of the episodes where we improvise some music with each other. And yeah, so Peter suggested to improvise some old style.
On a ground.
Yes, old style dances.
Fixed bass lines.
Yes.
So we have which ones do we have today?
So today we have Bergamasca and Passacaglia.
Great.
Old school.
Old school.
So, Peter.
Yes, Darina.
Tell us, how did you feel improvising with us? The first piece, the Bergamasca?
It was wonderful.
But I'm curious, what was how did you experience the process of making music? That's very interesting.
I will try to answer your question, but I have difficulty with that question because when I improvise, I'm in sort of a state so that when the improvisation is done, I forget everything that I've experienced. So it's like a blur to me. I can sort of try to recreate the feeling, but it's the same thing like when I'm composing. If I come up with an idea and I don't write it down, then I'll forget it. So I believe it was a pleasant experience to improvise with you guys. My recollection is that Darina, it was very beautiful because Darina played some long notes to create an atmosphere, and that I tried to sort of work my way into that atmosphere, and that we had a certain amount of dialogue in our improvisation, and then of course Sebastien was adding to that. So I would say it was a beautiful experience, and I really enjoyed it, but I've mostly forgotten it by now. Even though it was only 10 minutes ago. Yeah, sort of a blurry dream sort of thing. Because that's the state I go into when I improvise. And so I can't really tell the difference anymore between what I experienced and what was just some sort of imaginatory thing.
And where does your journey as an improviser come from? Because I heard that maybe you studied jazz guitar.
Yes, studied. I didn't really study jazz guitar, but my journey with improvisation, I think, just came from playing music by ear since I was 5 years old. When I was, I'll tell you a story about how I started playing guitar, and if it's not interesting, you can cut it out.
I'm sure it'll be very interesting.
You might. So I was, with my family, I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my parents took me to a street fair. And at this street fair, I wandered off. And I found myself in front of a stage where there were two men playing guitar and singing. And I stood there for a long time, completely transfixed, not noticing, not realizing that my parents weren't there with me. And after quite a while, my parents, in a panic, found me. And they said, "Peter, I'm glad we found you. You've been missing. We lost you." And I said, "I haven't been missing. I've been here listening to this music." And then little 4-year-old me pointed at the stage and said, "That's what I want to do." And so my parents actually had an old guitar lying around the house. So I just started playing it. And I did everything by ear. And so I started playing guitar when I was 5. And just as I turned 6, I did my first performance as a folk singer in a pizza bar, sort of a bar. Ironically, it was called Bimbo's. So I'm proud to say that I did my debut at Bimbo's. At the age of 6. And at the age of 6. And so I just was playing by ear and writing songs and improvising just because it came to me naturally. And everything was by ear. And then when I started playing, getting interested in jazz and started playing some jazz guitar, it was also by ear. I never actually had jazz guitar lessons at that point. Later, when I was at college, I played in jazz ensembles. And so for me, just my whole learning process in music was based on listening and imitating and creating. And that felt very, very natural to me as a child. And luckily, it's stayed. The feeling of naturalness of the improvisatory experience has stayed.
And when did you learn how to read the musical notation?
Probably, I think it wasn't until I was about 15 that, because I was taking classical guitar lessons. And it was a bit difficult for me because I didn't really have a relationship between the notes on the page and what I was hearing. And so I faked my way through a lot. Just sort of the teacher would play something and I would imitate the teacher. But finally, the pieces got more complicated. So by the time I was 15, I sort of had to learn to read music. So I started reading music when I was about 15, but I never really enjoyed the process. I would much rather improvise.
That's very interesting. Yes. Yeah, because my experience, and maybe yours, Sebastien, is also different. Yeah. First, I started with notation.
My education also started with notation. Yeah.
And I didn't even question myself if I'm enjoying reading music, if I'm enjoying the process or not. It's something natural. It's like reading a book for me.
Well, for me, it felt more like work. Yeah. Because for me, the improvisatory process and playing by ear, even starting when I was that young, was sort of a blissful experience. It just felt really wonderful. It was just pure enjoyment. And then having to sit down with the guitar and read music, it was work in comparison to bliss, in effect.
I have a question. Maybe I can ask a question. Or we
go for it.
No, because we were talking about how you saw these two singers and the guitarists playing, but I mean, when you grow up and when you were hearing all this music, I mean, it was kind of the apogee of the American folk scene. But is there some sort of connection between that and also the 16th century lute players and Dowland and all your interest in that older music as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a bit separate from the idea of improvising and playing by ear was that when I was 5 years old, I fell in love with the idea of, self-accompanied song and also the singer-songwriter process. And so I absolutely loved hearing people sing and play. And what it led to when I started, so much later, when I started playing lute, of course I discovered that one of the most important things is the lute song, which of course then would be connected to playing basso continuo. So already quite early on when I was playing lute, I was completely enamored with accompanying singers, whether it was already written out lute songs or playing basso continuo. So still to this day, I would consider one of my greatest passions is accompanying singers and also writing songs. I've written a lot of songs from a style, modern classical style to folk or jazz songs. And so that one moment when I was 5 years old it just sort of imprinted me with a love of this idea of singing and playing. And then I sang and played a lot until I was about 12. And I had one of these cute little boy sopranos. And then when my voice changed, when I was about 12 or 13, I absolutely hated my voice. So I stopped singing. But I kept my love of song and then accompanied other people. So this sort of natural feeling of improvising, also improvising leads to improvising accompaniments and also is connected with the song, whether it's singer-songwriter or jazz song or, Renaissance lute song or basso continuo song. It's all very connected to me, and I don't really see much of a difference between them, actually.
That's a beautiful concept. Yes, going back to our improvisation with Bergamasca, I felt we had this historical background, but we did it in a modern way, of course. How did you feel about that?
What do you mean by that?
I don't know, there were some sonorities and some notes or some passages maybe that didn't sound Renaissance-ish for me. Yes, I felt, even though we had this bass, very consistent. And what do we know about Bergamasca? Maybe for our listeners. Yeah, where does it come from? When did it appear?
Well, doesn't it come from Bergamo? And that's why it's called a Bergamasca. Yeah, I don't know much about the history of it besides that, but it's just this absolutely standard pattern of what they later called tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. I don't think they were calling it back in the 16th century, but just 1-4-5. And what's for me fascinating about it is that 1-4-5 that was so prominent in the 16th century just stayed. So you have a lot of pop music based on that. You have a lot of folk music based on that. And of course, in jazz, a lot's based on that too, but with altered chords, like with major 7s and flat 9s and stuff like that. So that's sort of the basis of of harmonic movement is the 1-4-5 movement. And so where I don't believe it actually came from Bergamo, I think people were just doing it because it was it was sort of a natural way. If you're playing chords, it's sort of a natural thing to move from C to F to G and back to C. But I don't have a historical, musicological knowledge of it.
So the next piece is a Passacaglia, and in D minor, because it's good for my traverso. I'm using this late Renaissance and very, very early Baroque instrument today, very special, in 440. I like this instrument, so probably we'll come up with some projects related to air de cour, because that's the proper instrument for this period of time. And maybe you could tell us more about your lute that you're using today.
Okay, the lute I'm using is a 7-course lute. Today it's called a Renaissance lute. Back then it was not called a Renaissance lute, it was just a lute. And it was a typical lute from around maybe 1590 to 1610. Because after this, the lute, they made lutes with more courses, 8-course lute, 9-course lute, 10-course. And the tuning, which we today call the Renaissance tuning, changed into what we call the Baroque tuning. And so the instrument changed actually quite significantly. So in modern terminology, it's a 7-course Renaissance lute from around 1600.
I think Passacaglia it's kind of a difficult bass line sometimes because it's almost too simple. And for me, at least with the harpsichord, in all my improvisation lessons and everything, it's all about how we can do everything to the Passacaglia. So we can change the bass line and change the harmonies and change all this. But just playing the simple one, for me, is quite tricky somehow.
For me to improvise and allow sort of my musical essence to come through, I have to drop the judgmental process. Because if my judgmental process is functioning when I improvise, then I can't improvise very well.
But my question is based not on a judgmental process, but on your aftertaste. How do you feel? Yes.
Yeah, it felt good. Yeah, it definitely felt good. And I felt that we sort of went into different passions that can be expressed through the Passacaglia. And that it was a really nice experience for me. So it felt good. That's probably the best I can say.
I felt it's like a friendship in a way. You start with some people that you don't know, and then you develop your relationship through the piece, and then you communicate better and better.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, the listeners, we don't have to hide it from the listeners that this is the first time that we three have played together.
Right.
That's the point of our podcast.
Yeah. So I've known Darina for a bit, but we never played together. Sebastien I met for the first time today.
Yes.
And it seems to me that this kind of improvisation is an absolutely ideal way of people getting to know each other musically. Because if you get together and you, sight read, then you're playing somebody else's music, in effect. And if you get together and do this, then we learn sort of who we are in a collective way, in the improvisatory process. And for me, some of the profoundest experiences in my life have been improvising with people. And you use the word friendship, and yes, it's like a friendship, but you're just getting to know people in a way that you wouldn't necessarily get to know them through conversation. And so I felt that, like, now Darina and Sebastien, I know you better because we experienced this improvisation together, but then that's just sort of like a belly feeling, rather than a feeling that I can really translate into words.
So for our final improvisation, we wanted to do something a bit different and channel some other directions that I think the three of us have experienced, and we wanted to do a completely free improvisation. Sort of contemporary-esque.
Yes, and
using our instruments.
Let's see what
see
will
what
come
happens.
yes, that was it.
That was it.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having me here. There's a lot that we could talk about. It's a fascinating subject, and I hope we continue this friendship.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, and see you next week.
Yes. So we'd like to welcome the live listening audience to our performance. We have been rehearsing this for 2 years every year.
Yes.
And finally we get a chance